January 1947 started mild, 14 degrees in Norfolk, daffodils pushing through in Cornwall. Spring seemed to be arriving early. People dared to hope that maybe this year would be easier. The war was over. The bombs had stopped falling. Surely the worst was behind them. No one imagined what was coming. Within a week, Britain would be buried. Snow falling somewhere in the country every single day for 55 days straight. Drifts 20 feet deep swallowing entire villages. Power stations shutting down one after another. 4 million people were thrown out of work. Candles flickering in Buckingham Palace because even the king had no electricity. Food rations cut below wartime levels. And a country already exhausted from 6 years of war fighting simply to survive the worst winter in 300 years. If you remember those times, or if someone in your family told you stories of that winter, then this channel is for you. We bring back the Britain that shaped a generation, the hardships they faced, and the way they came through together. Subscribe and share your memories in the comments below. Your stories matter, and they deserve to be told. Picture Britain in early 1947. The streets still bore the scars of the Blitz. Gap-toothed terraces where houses used to stand. Prefab bungalows thrown up to solve the housing crisis. Thin walls that let in every draft. Condensation running down windows every morning. Ration books sat on kitchen tables. Meat is still limited. Butter is scarce. And for the first time ever, bread itself was rationed, something that had never been necessary even during the darkest days of the war. Queues formed outside every shop, women in headscarves waiting patiently with baskets, children hand-me-down coats too big or too small. The wireless crackled in living rooms bringing news from the BBC Home Service. Coal fires glowed in hearths, but coal was getting harder to find. The familiar rumble of the coalman shoveling fuel down the chute into cellars. The smell of smoke hanging in still winter air mixing with fog to create the thick yellow smog that Londoners knew so well. This was a nation that had won the war, but not yet won the peace. Tired, hopeful, fragile. At the power stations, coal stocks had fallen dangerously low. Only 4 weeks' supply sat in the yards. Before the war, they kept 12 weeks in reserve. Emmanuel Shinwell, the Minister of Fuel and Power, knew the risk. He had been warned in October that a shortage was possible, but he gambled. He bet on a mild winter. He bet wrong. On January the 20th, the first frost arrived. The next day, an anticyclone formed over Scandinavia and began to drift southward. This massive high-pressure system would lock into place over northern Europe and refuse to move. It blocked every Atlantic depression that tried to bring milder air to Britain. Instead, it pulled bitterly cold winds straight from Siberia across the North Sea and onto British shores. The trap was set. January the 23rd, 1947. Snow began falling across southern England. Heavy and persistent, the southwest took the first hit. Devon villages found themselves cut off within hours. And then something remarkable happened. Snow fell on the Isles of Scilly, those subtropical islands off the Cornish coast where palm trees grow and frost is almost unknown. 7 inches of snow covered them. It was the worst blizzard in the southwest since 1891, and the snow kept coming, day after day, week after week. From January the 22nd to March the 17th, snow fell somewhere in Britain every single day. 55 consecutive days of snowfall. The temperatures rarely rose more than a degree or 2 above freezing. When the skies cleared at night, the cold became savage. At Woburn in Bedfordshire, thermometers dropped to minus 21 degrees Celsius. At Kew Observatory in London, the temperature never topped 4.4 degrees for the entire month of February. On 22 of the 28 days, there was no sunshine at all. People woke to darkness, worked in gloom, and went to bed in darkness again. The snow accumulated because it had no chance to melt. Several falls dumped 60 centimeters or more. In Upper Teesdale and the Denbighshire Hills, level snow reached 150 centimeters deep. Drifts were something else entirely. Across the Pennines, they reached 5 meters. In the Scottish Highlands, 7 meters. 23 feet of snow piled against walls and hedges and buried roads completely. Villages vanished. Snowshill in the Cotswolds was cut off for a fortnight. The only supplies came when Charles Jarrett, the local baker, managed to force his van up the hill to deliver bread. The following week, the road was blocked again, with drifts 4.5 meters deep. In the Peak District, the villages of Grindon, Unicote, Wetton and Butterton found themselves completely isolated from the outside world. No roads in or out, no deliveries, no post, just white silence and bitter cold. The coal crisis hit first. Stockpiles at the pits froze solid. Miners could not move the fuel even when they dug it from the ground. The railways seized up. 750,000 coal wagons sat trapped in sidings and yards, buried under snow or frozen to the tracks. The arteries that carried fuel to power stations were blocked completely. One by one, the generating plants began to shut down. They simply had nothing to burn. On Friday, February the 7th, Emmanuel Shinwell stood before Parliament and announced the measures nobody wanted to hear. From the following Monday, electricity supplies to industry in London, the Midlands and the North West would be suspended completely. Factories would close. Workers would be sent home. For households, there would be no electricity for 5 hours every day. The domestic supply cut to 19 hours. Television, which had only recently resumed after the war, went dark entirely. The BBC suspended its service. Radio broadcasts were cut back severely. Magazines were ordered to stop publishing. Newspapers shrank to 4 pages. A single sheet of paper to cover all the news of a nation in crisis. The blackouts began. In homes across Britain, families gathered around candles and oil lamps. At Buckingham Palace, staff worked by candlelight. At the Houses of Parliament, debates continued in the dim glow of emergency lighting. At the Central Electricity Board headquarters in London, workers could barely see their desks. A housewife named Florence Speed wrote in her diary, "I was frozen today. Gas is on at such low pressure. I worked with a scarf over my head, mittens on, and a rug round my legs." At Oxford University, a young undergraduate named Kingsley Amis wrote to his friend Philip Larkin, "Christ, it is bleeding cold." The banker Evelyn Baring reported that from 9 to 12 and 2 to 4, they worked in the dim glow of candlelight or nightlight. Life, he said, was quite impossible. Unemployment exploded. In mid-January, 400,000 people were out of work. By mid-February, that number had risen to 1.75 million. Factories stood idle. Production lines are silent. Workers who had survived the war found themselves queuing not for rations, but for the dole. The economic damage mounted by the hour. Industrial output would fall by 10% for the entire year. Britain was bleeding money it did not have. The Royal Navy launched Operation Blackcurrant. Submarines sailed to coastal towns and dockyards where their diesel generators could provide emergency power. It was an improvised solution born of desperation. Out at sea and in the ports, sailors worked to keep lights on and essential services running while the national grid failed. But here is what you need to understand about 1947. For all the suffering and all the hardship, something else was happening too. Britain was pulling together. On Sunday, February the 16th, the miners of Wales did something extraordinary. They volunteered to work a full shift on their day of rest. Coal Sunday, they called it. Thousands of men went down into the pits because their country needed them. The newspapers praised their Dunkirk spirit, that same stubborn refusal to give in that had seen Britain through the war. Ordinary people doing what needed to be done without being asked twice. The armed forces mobilized. 100,000 soldiers began clearing snow from the railways by hand. British troops, Polish troops, and German prisoners of war worked side by side, shoveling and digging to free those 750,000 trapped coal wagons. In temperatures well below freezing, they labored hour after hour to get Britain moving again. When the roads could not be cleared, the RAF took to the skies. Supply drops were organized to reach villages that had been cut off for weeks. Sacks of flour, tins of meat, medical supplies, all packed into containers and dropped from aircraft to people who had no other way of receiving help. The villagers of Longnaw and Butterton were told to mark drop zones in the snow with large crosses made from soot so the pilots could find them. On February the 12th, 1947, a Halifax bomber from No. 47 Squadron took off from RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire. The crew were heading to drop supplies to Butterton. The weather was terrible. Cloud down to 100 feet above ground level. They made one run but could not find the village. They radioed that they were trying again. On the second or third attempt, the aircraft struck the highest point of Grindon Moor. A wingtip caught the ground first. The Halifax cartwheeled across the road and along the fields, disintegrating and bursting into flames. All 8 crew members were killed, young men who died trying to bring bread and tinned meat to families they had never met. There is a memorial on that moor today, a reminder of ordinary heroism in extraordinary times. In the towns and cities, neighbours helped neighbours. Coal was shared when supplies ran low. Food stretched further when cooked together. Those with fireplaces welcomed those without. Children were sent to stay with relatives who had better heating. The queues outside shops grew longer, but people waited patiently. They had learned patience during the war. They knew how to make do. And the children. For them there was another side to this winter. Adventure, excitement, sledges fashioned from old boards, snowball fights in streets transformed into white wonderlands, building snowmen as tall as houses, tunneling through drifts to reach the front door. For a generation of children who would grow up to remember this winter, it was hardship, yes, but it was also magic. March arrived, and the cold continued. On the 4th and 5th of March, one of the worst blizzards of the 20th century struck. Heavy snow fell across most of England and Wales with severe drifting. By the 6th of March, drifts were 5 meters deep in the Pennines and 3 meters deep in the Chilterns. On March the 14th, at Forest in Teesdale in County Durham, the deepest snow ever recorded in an inhabited location in Britain was measured, 83 inches. 210 centimeters, nearly 7 feet of level snow on the ground. Then, on March the 10th, the air changed. Milder weather began pushing north from the southwest. Temperatures climbed, 7 degrees, 10 degrees. After weeks of bitter cold, it felt like summer. The snow began to melt, but the ground beneath was frozen solid. The meltwater could not soak in. It ran straight off the surface and into the rivers. Every stream swelled, every river rose. And then, on March the 15th, a deep depression rolled in from the Atlantic, bringing heavy rain and gale-force winds reaching 80 miles per hour. Trees crashed down, telephone lines snapped, and the floods came. The River Avon burst its banks at Evesham, flooding Waterside and Port Street. The River Thames rose to its highest level of the 20th century. The Lea Valley, northeast of London, saw its filter beds flooded, cutting water supplies to more than 1 million people. Across 31 counties south of the River Ouse, the waters spread. 100,000 properties were flooded. The army was called out again. Foreign aid agencies sent help. Britain needed humanitarian assistance in its own towns and villages. The floods destroyed 70,000 acres of wheat and 80,000 tons of potatoes. Food that a hungry nation desperately needed washed away or rotted in waterlogged fields. The winter has not finished punishing Britain yet. When the waters finally receded, the full cost became clear. Over 2 million sheep and lambs had perished. A quarter of the national flock was gone. 30,000 cattle died. Farmers who had survived the war lost everything to the weather. It would take 6 years for sheep numbers to recover. In Wales, a disaster fund of more than £4 million was set up just to help farmers who had lost their animals. The damage to industry totaled hundreds of millions of pounds. In today's money, more than 12 billion. Cereal and potato harvests were down 10 to 20%. The government, which had spent heavily on the armed forces, on the new National Health Service, and on rebuilding from the war, found itself facing economic disaster. The pound would be devalued from $4 to $2.80. The Marshall Plan to rescue war-torn Europe was accelerated, partly because of what happened in Britain that winter. Some historians mark this winter as the beginning of Britain's decline from superpower status. Emanuel Shinwell never admitted that the crisis resulted from low coal supplies. He blamed the weather, he blamed the railways, he blamed capitalism generally. The public blamed him. He received death threats and had to be placed under police guard. By October, he had resigned. The Labour government never fully recovered its reputation. They won the next election in 1950, but with a tiny majority. By 1951, the Conservatives were back in power. The winter of '47 had changed British politics. It changed something else too. Thousands of families looked at the bombed-out streets, the endless queues, the rationing that seemed to go on forever, and the memory of that terrible winter. They made a decision. They would leave. The £10 POM scheme that sent British families to Australia saw a surge of applicants. People who could not face another winter like that one. People who wanted sunshine and space and hope. The winter of '47 emptied villages and changed the population of a nation. But for those who stayed, something had been proven. Britain could take it. The same spirit that had held during the Blitz held during the freeze. Neighbours helped neighbours. Strangers became friends. Ordinary people did extraordinary things. They queued without complaint. They shared what little they had. They got on with it. 78 years have passed since that winter. The generation who lived through it is leaving us now. Their memories of ice inside the windows and candles on the kitchen table and walking through snow to school are fading into history. But their resilience, their community, their refusal to be beaten, that is worth remembering. Today we face our own challenges. Energy prices that make people choose between heating and eating. Cost of living pressures that would be familiar to anyone who lived through rationing. Perhaps there is something in the story of 1947 that speaks to us still. Not nostalgia for hardship. Nobody wants to go back to outdoor privies and powdered eggs. But nostalgia for something else. For the way people looked out for each other. For the way a nation pulled together. For the knowledge that hard times reveal character and that character matters. If your parents or grandparents told you stories of that winter, share them in the comments below. Did they tunnel out of snowdrifts? Did they work by candlelight? Did they queue for bread that was rationed for the first time in British history? Those stories deserve to be remembered. That generation did not complain much. They just got through. And they built the Britain we inherited. The winter of 1947. The year Britain barely survived. And the year that showed what survival really means.